The morning sun cast long shadows across the military barracks in Ouagadougou as Captain Ibrahim Traoré adjusted his uniform for what would become a historic day. At 34 years old, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen enough corruption and foreign interference to last several lifetimes. His fellow soldiers had been whispering for months about the need for change, but today, those whispers would transform into action. Burkina Faso had been bleeding slowly for years. While international mining companies extracted billions of dollars worth of gold from their soil, ordinary citizens struggled to afford basic necessities. French military bases dotted the landscape, supposedly fighting terrorism, yet attacks on civilians continued to increase. The previous government had signed agreements that favored foreign interests over the welfare of Burkina Faso people, and Captain Traoré had grown tired of watching his country's resources flow elsewhere while his people suffered. The young captain had spent countless sleepless nights studying the contracts and agreements that bound his nation. He discovered clauses that guaranteed foreign companies massive profits while leaving crumbs for local communities. Mining operations displaced entire villages without adequate compensation, and environmental damage was treated as an acceptable cost of doing business. The more he learned, the angrier he became. That September morning in 2022, Traoré gathered with a group of trusted military officers who shared his vision for a truly independent Burkina Faso. They had been meeting secretly for weeks, planning what they called Operation Restoration. The goal was simple but dangerous: remove the current government and establish a new administration that would prioritize Burkina Faso interests above all else. The captain knew the risks involved in challenging the established order. Previous coup attempts in West Africa had resulted in international sanctions, economic isolation, and sometimes violent retaliation. But he also understood that continuing on the current path meant slow economic strangulation and perpetual dependence on foreign powers who viewed Burkina Faso merely as a source of cheap raw materials. As radio communications crackled with coded messages, Traoré reflected on his childhood in rural Burkina Faso. He remembered watching his grandmother struggle to pay for medicine while foreign executives lived in luxury compounds surrounded by high walls and armed guards. He recalled classmates dropping out of school because their families couldn't afford fees, even as international aid money supposedly poured into education programs. The military compound buzzed with nervous energy as soldiers prepared for the operation. Some checked their weapons. Others reviewed maps of strategic locations throughout the capital. Traoré moved among them calmly, offering words of encouragement and reminding them why they were taking this momentous step. He spoke of their children's futures, of breaking free from economic chains forged decades earlier, of building a nation that served its own people first. By mid-morning, reports began filtering in from across Ouagadougou. Key government buildings had been secured, and several high-ranking officials had been placed under protective custody. The operation was proceeding according to plan, but Traoré knew the real challenges lay ahead. Taking power was only the beginning. Keeping it while implementing meaningful change would require unprecedented skill and determination. International news networks quickly picked up the story, describing yet another military coup in West Africa. But Traoré saw it differently. This wasn't just a power grab by ambitious soldiers. It was a carefully planned response to years of exploitation and neglect. The captain had studied successful independence movements throughout history, learning from leaders who had successfully challenged colonial and neo-colonial systems. As evening approached, Traoré prepared to address the nation for the first time as its new leader. He had written his speech by hand, refusing offers from advisors to help craft his message. The words had to come from his heart, expressing not just his personal convictions, but the hopes and frustrations of millions of Burkina Faso citizens who had watched their country's wealth disappear while their living conditions deteriorated. Standing before the microphones that would broadcast his message across the nation and around the world, Captain Ibrahim Traoré took a deep breath. He was about to announce a new chapter in Burkina Faso's history, one that would inevitably bring conflict with powerful foreign interests, but might finally deliver the justice and sovereignty his people deserved. The young captain understood that this moment marked the point of no return, both for himself and for his nation. The announcement that would change everything came at 8 p.m. sharp. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before a simple backdrop bearing the Burkina Faso flag, his military uniform pressed and his expression serious but determined. Across the nation, families gathered around radios and televisions, sensing that history was being made in their small West African country. His first words were not about military strategy or political maneuvering, but about dignity. Traoré spoke directly to ordinary citizens, acknowledging their daily struggles and promising that the era of putting foreign interests before local needs was ending. He explained that the military intervention was necessary because democratic institutions had been captured by external forces and were no longer serving the Burkina Faso people. Within hours of the broadcast, international reactions began pouring in. The African Union issued statements calling for a return to constitutional order. France's foreign ministry expressed concern about the stability of their former colony, while mining companies quietly began assessing the security of their operations. The Economic Community of West African States scheduled emergency meetings to discuss potential sanctions. But on the streets of Ouagadougou and in villages across the country, the response was markedly different. Young people who had grown up watching foreign companies extract their nation's wealth while they struggled with unemployment began celebrating. Market vendors who had seen their purchasing power eroded by inflation and corruption spoke hopefully about change. Even skeptical elders admitted that something needed to be done about the country's direction. Traoré wasted no time in demonstrating that his administration would operate differently from its predecessors. Within his first week in power, he ordered comprehensive audits of all mining contracts signed in the previous decade. Teams of local lawyers and economists began examining agreements that had been negotiated behind closed doors, often with terms that heavily favored international corporations. The results were shocking, even to those who expected corruption. Some contracts guaranteed foreign companies tax holidays lasting 15 years, while others allowed them to repatriate profits without investing meaningful amounts in local infrastructure or job training. Environmental protection clauses were either absent or so weak that they provided no real safeguard against ecological damage. One particularly egregious agreement had granted a Canadian mining company the right to extract gold from a region that was home to several thousand farmers and herders. The contract included provisions forcing the government to relocate these communities at its own expense, while providing no compensation mechanism for lost livelihoods or cultural disruption. These revelations became public. Support for Traoré's government grew stronger among ordinary citizens. People who had initially been cautious about military rule began to understand why civilian politicians had failed to protect national interests. The captain had pulled back the curtain on decades of deals that had enriched foreign shareholders, while keeping Burkina Faso among the world's poorest countries. International pressure, meanwhile, continued to mount. Western diplomats in Ouagadougou requested meetings with the new leadership, ostensibly to discuss humanitarian concerns, but actually to gauge how far Traoré intended to push his reforms. Mining company executives began lobbying their home governments to pressure Burkina Faso into honoring existing contracts. The captain proved to be a shrewd negotiator in these early encounters with foreign representatives. Rather than adopting an aggressive stance, he calmly presented the evidence his teams had uncovered about unfair mining deals and asked whether foreign governments would accept similar terms if applied to their own natural resources. Most visitors left these meetings without clear answers to give their superiors. Domestically, Traoré moved quickly to build broader support for his administration. He appointed civilians to key ministerial positions, choosing economists and engineers over military officers for most roles. He established citizen advisory councils in major cities, creating channels for public input on government policies. Most importantly, he began redirecting mining revenues toward infrastructure projects that would benefit ordinary Burkinabe citizens. The first major test of Traoré's resolve came when a French mining consortium threatened to suspend operations if their tax benefits were revoked. The company employed several thousand workers and contributed significantly to local economies in 3 provinces. International observers expected the new government to back down rather than risk economic disruption and unemployment. Instead, Traoré called the company's bluff. In a televised address, he explained that Burkina Faso was willing to discuss fair partnerships but would no longer accept exploitative arrangements. He announced that government teams were prepared to take over mining operations if foreign companies chose to abandon them rather than operate under equitable terms. The confrontation sent shockwaves through international business circles. For decades, African governments had been seen as too weak or corrupt to challenge multinational corporations effectively. Traoré's willingness to risk economic short-term pain for long-term sovereignty represented a fundamental shift in the power dynamic between wealthy countries and their former colonies. The confrontation with the French mining consortium reached its climax on a scorching Tuesday morning in November 2022. Company executives had flown in from Paris, expecting to negotiate with a typical African military leader who could be intimidated or bought off with personal incentives. Instead, they found themselves facing Captain Traoré and a team of sharp local lawyers who had spent weeks preparing for this moment. The meeting took place in the Presidential Palace, a modest building that Traoré had refused to renovate despite its outdated facilities. He believed that spending money on luxury while citizens lacked clean water would send the wrong message about his administration's priorities. The French executives, accustomed to dealing with African leaders in opulent settings, seemed uncomfortable with the austere surroundings. Traoré opened the discussion by presenting a detailed analysis of the mining company's operations over the previous 10 years. His team had calculated that while the corporation had extracted gold worth over $2 billion from Burkinabe soil, the government had received less than $50 million in taxes and royalties. Meanwhile, local communities near the Defiant mines had seen their water sources contaminated and their farmland rendered unusable. The company's lead negotiator, a silver-haired man named Philippe Dubois, initially tried to lecture Traoré about the importance of honoring international agreements. He spoke about investor confidence and the rule of law, suggesting that renegotiating contracts would damage Burkina Faso's reputation in global markets. His tone was condescending, as if he were addressing a child rather than a head of state. "Captain." Traoré listened patiently before responding with a question that would later become famous throughout West Africa. He asked whether France would accept a deal allowing foreign companies to extract French gold while paying only 2% of its value to the French government. When Dubois stammered that such a comparison wasn't relevant, Traoré pointed out that natural resources belong to nations and their people, regardless of which continent they happen to be located on. The negotiations continued for 3 days, with both sides bringing in additional experts and legal advisors. International media began following the story closely, recognizing that the outcome could set precedents for resource extraction agreements across Africa. Mining industry publications ran worried editorials about the potential for other countries to follow Burkina Faso's example. During the second day of talks, Traoré received intelligence reports indicating that some foreign governments were discussing military intervention to protect their economic interests. The captain knew that several West African leaders had been overthrown or assassinated when they challenged multinational corporations too aggressively. But he also understood that backing down now would mean abandoning the principles that had motivated his takeover in the first place. On the negotiation table, the stakes kept rising. The mining company threatened to withdraw completely and file international arbitration cases seeking billions in compensation. Traoré countered by revealing environmental impact studies that had been suppressed during the original contract negotiations, showing that mining operations had caused permanent damage to watersheds affecting hundreds of thousands of people. The breakthrough came when one of Traoré's advisors suggested a creative compromise. Instead of simply renegotiating the existing contract, Burkina Faso would offer the company a new partnership agreement. The corporation could continue operating, but they would be required to invest 60% of their profits in local infrastructure, education, and healthcare programs. They would also have to hire and train Burkinabe citizens for technical positions, gradually reducing their reliance on foreign expertise. Initially, the French executives rejected this proposal outright, claiming it would make their operations unprofitable. But Traoré's team had done their homework, presenting detailed financial analyses showing that even with the new requirements, the company would still earn substantial returns on their investment. The captain also pointed out that the alternative might be complete nationalization of the mining sector. As news of the ongoing negotiations leaked to the public, demonstrations of support for Traoré's position erupted across the country. University. Students marched through Ouagadougou carrying signs reading "Our Gold, Our Future." Rural communities that had been displaced by mining operations sent delegations to the capital, sharing stories of environmental destruction and broken promises about compensation. The international response was mixed but increasingly concerned. Some African leaders privately praised Traoré's courage while publicly maintaining diplomatic neutrality. European governments found themselves caught between supporting their corporations and avoiding the appearance of neo-colonial interference. The United States, focused on other global priorities, issued generic statements calling for peaceful resolution. On the third day, as tensions reached a peak, an unexpected development changed the dynamic completely. Traoré received a delegation of young French activists who had traveled to Burkina Faso to express solidarity with his administration. These activists, representing environmental and social justice organizations, had been protesting their own government support for exploitative mining practices in Africa. Their presence reminded everyone that this wasn't simply a conflict between Burkina Faso and France, but rather a struggle between those who benefited from extractive economic relationships and those who suffered from them. The French activists brought with them detailed research about their company's operations in other countries, revealing patterns of environmental damage and community displacement that extended far beyond West Africa. By the evening of the third day, momentum had shifted decisively in Traoré's favor. The mining company's executives realized that continuing to resist would likely result in greater scrutiny of their global operations and potential legal challenges in multiple countries. More importantly, they began to understand that Traoré was not a typical military strongman who could be intimidated or corrupted, but rather a leader with genuine popular support and a clear vision for his country's future. The agreement signed on that November evening would reshape not only Burkina Faso's economy, but also influence similar negotiations across Africa. Philippe Dubois reluctantly put his signature on a document that required his company to pay fair taxes, invest heavily in local development, and submit to regular environmental monitoring by Burkinabe authorities. More importantly, the contract included provisions for technology transfer and skills training that would eventually allow local workers to take over most technical positions. Captain Traoré watched the signing ceremony with quiet satisfaction, knowing that this moment represented a fundamental shift in how African countries could engage with international corporations. Word of the successful renegotiation spread quickly throughout the continent, inspiring other leaders to examine their own resource extraction agreements with fresh eyes. But Traoré understood that winning one battle didn't mean the war was over. International pressure continued to mount as other mining companies began reassessing their operations in West Africa. Some corporations quietly accelerated their extraction activities, hoping to maximize profits before facing similar renegotiations. Others began lobbying their home governments to impose economic sanctions on Burkina Faso as an example to other potentially rebellious nations. The captain's response was characteristically bold and unconventional. Rather than hiding from international scrutiny, he embraced it. Traoré began accepting invitations to speak at universities and think tanks around the world, presenting Burkina Faso's case directly to international audiences. His message was simple but powerful. African countries deserved the same right to control their natural resources that every other nation took for granted. These speaking engagements created unexpected diplomatic challenges for Western governments. When Traoré spoke at Oxford University, students gave him a standing ovation after he explained how current mining agreements prevented African countries from developing their own technical expertise. His appearance at Harvard Business School sparked intense debates about corporate responsibility and economic justice that continued long after he returned to Ouagadougou. Meanwhile, back home, the real work of transformation was beginning. The additional revenues from renegotiated mining contracts allowed Traoré's government to launch ambitious infrastructure projects that had been delayed for decades due to lack of funding. Construction began on new hospitals in rural areas, solar power installations brought electricity to remote villages, and scholarship programs enabled promising students to pursue technical education abroad. The changes were most visible in communities that had been directly affected by mining operations. In Bissa, a town near one of the country's largest gold mines, the local government used mining revenues to build a modern water treatment facility that served 50,000 people. In Kaya, mining companies were required to fund agricultural development programs that helped displaced farmers transition to new livelihoods. Not all of Traoré's initiatives were immediately successful. Some infrastructure projects faced delays due to inexperienced local contractors and bureaucratic inefficiencies. A few mining companies found creative ways to circumvent new regulations, leading to tense confrontations with government inspectors. International banks, under pressure from Western governments, began making it more difficult for Burkina Faso to access development loans. The captain addressed these challenges with the same methodical approach he had used during the mining negotiations. He recruited experienced engineers and project managers from other African countries, offering competitive salaries to build local expertise. Government agencies responsible for monitoring mining operations received additional training and equipment, making it harder for companies to avoid compliance with environmental regulations. One of Traoré's most controversial decisions involved the French military presence in Burkina Faso. For years, French forces had maintained bases in the country under the pretense of fighting terrorism and maintaining regional stability. However, Traoré had studied intelligence reports showing that terrorist attacks had actually increased during the period of French military involvement, leading him to question whether foreign military intervention was helping or hindering security efforts. In January 2023, after careful consultation with his military advisors, Traoré announced that Burkina Faso would not renew agreements allowing French forces to operate on its territory. The decision sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles in Paris and Washington, as military bases in Burkina Faso were considered strategically important for projecting Western influence throughout West Africa. French officials reacted with barely concealed anger, threatening to withdraw development aid and impose trade restrictions. Military analysts in various Western capitals warned that Traoré's decision would create opportunities for rival powers like Russia and China to expand their influence in the region. Some commentators even suggested that removing French military protection would lead to increased terrorist activity and political instability. Traoré's response was typically direct and well-reasoned. In a televised address to the nation, he pointed out that foreign military interventions had failed to prevent terrorist attacks against Burkinabe civilians and had sometimes resulted in civilian casualties that fueled resentment among local populations. He announced that Burkina Faso would instead invest in training and equipping its own security forces, using revenues from fair mining contracts to purchase modern equipment and establish professional military academies. The announcement sparked massive celebrations in Ouagadougou and other major cities, as citizens interpreted the decision as another step toward genuine independence from foreign domination. Young people especially embraced Traoré's vision of a truly sovereign Burkina Faso that could defend itself without relying on former colonial powers. International observers watched these developments with a mixture of admiration and concern. Some praised Traoré's courage in challenging relationships that had kept Africa dependent on Western powers for decades. Others worried that his confrontational approach might provoke backlash that could destabilize not only Burkina Faso, but the entire West African region. As 2023 progressed, it became clear that Traoré's administration was implementing the most comprehensive transformation of state-society relations that Burkina Faso had experienced since independence. The young captain had moved far beyond simply changing government personnel. He was attempting to reshape fundamental economic and political relationships that had governed his country for generations. The retaliation came in forms both subtle and direct. By March 2023, Burkina Faso found itself increasingly isolated from traditional Western financial institutions. International development banks, which had previously provided loans for infrastructure projects, suddenly discovered bureaucratic obstacles that delayed funding applications indefinitely. European companies that had done business in Burkina Faso for decades began receiving unofficial guidance from their governments to limit new investments. Captain Traoré anticipated these pressures and had been preparing alternative strategies. His administration reached out to other African countries that had successfully diversified their international partnerships, learning from Ghana's experience with South Korean investment and Rwanda's relationships with Chinese development agencies. The captain understood that reducing dependence on Western institutions would require building connections with a broader range of global partners. The most serious challenge came from an unexpected source: the CFA franc monetary system that tied Burkina Faso's currency to French financial policies. As tensions with France escalated, Traoré began questioning why his country's monetary policy was controlled by institutions in Paris rather than Ouagadougou. He commissioned studies examining how the CFA franc system affected Burkina Faso's ability to respond to economic challenges and invest in local development priorities. The findings were disturbing, but not surprising. Burkina Faso was required to deposit 50% of its foreign currency reserves in the French treasury, effectively providing low-interest loans to one of the world's wealthiest countries. The country could not devalue its currency to make exports more competitive, nor could it print money to fund infrastructure projects during economic downturns. Most crucially, the system made it difficult for Burkina Faso to trade directly with other African countries, as most transactions had to be processed through European financial institutions. Traoré's decision to explore alternatives to the CFA franc represented perhaps the most radical challenge to French influence in West Africa since independence. Previous leaders who had attempted to leave the monetary union had faced coups, assassinations, or economic warfare designed to force them back into compliance. The captain knew the risks, but he also understood that genuine economic sovereignty was impossible while foreign institutions controlled his country's monetary policy. The announcement that Burkina Faso was studying alternatives to the CFA franc triggered panic in certain circles. French economists published articles warning about monetary chaos and hyperinflation if West African countries abandoned the existing system. International investors expressed concerns about currency stability and convertibility. Some Western media outlets began running stories about growing Russian and Chinese influence in West Africa, suggesting that Traoré's policies were part of a broader geopolitical realignment. But the captain's approach to monetary independence was characteristically careful and methodical. Rather than immediately abandoning the CFA franc, he began building institutions that could eventually support an independent currency. Burkina Faso established trade agreements with neighboring countries that allowed for direct exchanges of goods and services without using European intermediaries. The government also began accepting tax payments in local agricultural products, reducing the economy's dependence on hard currency for basic government operations. These innovations caught the attention of other West African leaders who had grown frustrated with the limitations of the CFA franc system. Mali and Niger, both facing similar pressures from international corporations and former colonial powers, began informal consultations with Traoré about coordinating their responses to Western economic pressure. The possibility of a broader West African rebellion against neo-colonial economic structures suddenly seemed realistic. International attempts to isolate Burkina Faso began backfiring in unexpected ways when European development agencies reduced their funding for education and healthcare programs. Traoré successfully appealed to the African Union for assistance. Other African countries, inspired by Burkina Faso's example and eager to demonstrate continental solidarity, provided teachers, medical equipment, and technical expertise that partially offset Western aid reductions. More surprisingly, progressive organizations and individuals in Western countries began supporting Burkina Faso's transformation efforts. Environmental groups praised the country's new mining regulations, which required comprehensive environmental impact assessments and community consent before new extraction projects could begin. Human rights organizations highlighted improvements in transparency and public participation in government decision-making under Traoré's administration. These international expressions of support helped counter official Western government hostility and provided moral legitimacy for Burkina Faso's reformist agenda. When French media outlets published negative stories about political instability under military rule, international observers could point to concrete evidence of improved governance and economic management since Traoré's takeover. The captain used this growing international support to launch his most ambitious initiative yet, the creation of a West African Development Bank that would provide financing for infrastructure projects without the conditions typically imposed by Western aid institutions. The bank would be capitalized using revenues from fairly negotiated mining contracts and would prioritize projects that benefited ordinary citizens rather than foreign investors. The proposal attracted immediate interest from other African leaders, who had grown tired of dealing with development agencies that imposed structural adjustment programs and austerity measures as conditions for financial assistance. Ghana's president publicly endorsed the initiative, while Nigeria's government indicated informal support for alternatives to Western-dominated financial institutions. By late 2023, it became clear that Traoré's defiance of international pressure had inspired a broader movement for African economic independence. University students across the continent organized conferences on resource sovereignty and monetary independence. Young entrepreneurs began exploring business models that emphasized intra-African trade and technology transfer. Even established political leaders who had previously been cautious about challenging Western economic dominance began adopting more assertive negotiating positions. The transformation was not limited to government policies and international relations. Within Burkina Faso, Traoré's administration had unleashed a wave of innovation and entrepreneurship as young people gained access to education and capital that had previously been unavailable. Technical schools established with mining revenues began graduating engineers and technicians who could work in extraction industries without foreign supervision. Agricultural cooperatives used government microcredit programs to purchase modern equipment and improve productivity. Most importantly, ordinary citizens began to believe that meaningful change was possible. The combination of improved public services, increased economic opportunities, and restored national dignity created a sense of optimism that had been absent from Burkina Faso for generations. People who had previously accepted poverty and foreign Domination, as inevitable, began demanding better living conditions and greater control over their country's future. By December 2024, Captain Ibrahim Traoré had fundamentally altered not only Burkina Faso's trajectory, but also the broader conversation about African sovereignty and economic independence. What had begun as a military intervention to address corruption and foreign exploitation had evolved into a comprehensive model for post-colonial development that other nations were beginning to study and adapt. The results spoke for themselves. Burkina Faso's economy had grown by 12% in 2024, driven primarily by increased revenues from renegotiated mining contracts and new investments in manufacturing and agriculture. Unemployment among young people had dropped from 42% to 28% as government infrastructure projects and private sector growth created new opportunities. Most remarkably, the country had achieved these improvements while reducing its dependence on foreign aid and international loans. The social transformation was equally impressive. Literacy rates had increased dramatically as the government used mining revenues to build schools and train teachers in rural areas that had been neglected for decades. Healthcare outcomes improved as new hospitals and clinics brought modern medical services to communities that had previously relied on traditional healers and informal practitioners. Clean water systems reached villages that had never had reliable access to safe drinking water. International recognition of these achievements came from unexpected sources. The African Union awarded Traoré its Leadership Prize for Economic Innovation, citing Burkina Faso's success in negotiating fair partnerships with international corporations while maintaining political stability. Several European universities invited him to establish exchange programs that would allow African students to study engineering and business administration while contributing to their home country's development. More significantly, other African leaders began implementing similar policies in their own countries. Ghana renegotiated its mining agreements using strategies pioneered in Burkina Faso, resulting in billions of additional revenue for infrastructure and education. Mali and Niger coordinated their responses to foreign military presence, eventually establishing a mutual defense pact that reduced their reliance on external security providers. The success of these coordinated efforts led to the creation of the West African Economic Sovereignty Alliance, a regional organization dedicated to promoting fair trade relationships and preventing the exploitation of natural resources by international corporations. The alliance established its headquarters in Ouagadougou, recognizing Traoré's role as the intellectual architect of the new approach to international economic relations. Western governments gradually adapted to the reality that their traditional methods of controlling African economies were no longer sustainable. Some corporations found that operating under fairer terms actually increased their long-term profitability by reducing community conflicts and improving worker productivity. Progressive political leaders in Europe and North America began citing Burkina Faso's example when advocating for more equitable international development policies. The monetary independence that had seemed so threatening to financial institutions in Paris and London proved to be manageable and even beneficial for regional stability. The West African Economic Cooperation Currency, launched in late 2024 by Burkina Faso and 3 neighboring countries, maintained stable exchange rates while allowing member nations greater flexibility in responding to economic challenges. Trade between participating countries increased by 30% in the currency's first year of operation. Traoré himself evolved from military coup leader to respected statesman, regularly consulted by other African leaders on economic policy and international negotiations. His autobiography, titled Sovereignty Before Profit, became a bestseller across the continent and was translated into multiple languages. Young people throughout Africa adopted his speeches and writings as texts for understanding how to challenge injustice while building practical alternatives. The captain's most important legacy, however, was the demonstration that small African countries could successfully resist economic exploitation without triggering the chaos and instability that Western governments had long predicted would result from such defiance. Burkina Faso maintained peaceful relations with its neighbors, avoided ethnic conflicts that had plagued other countries during periods of rapid change, and established democratic institutions that provided genuine opportunities for citizen participation in government decision-making. As 2025 began, Traoré announced his intention to transition Burkina Faso back to civilian rule within 2 years, having achieved the economic and institutional reforms that had motivated his original intervention. The announcement surprised international observers, who had expected him to follow the pattern of other military leaders who had consolidated power indefinitely. But the captain remained consistent with his original vision of temporary military involvement to address specific problems rather than permanent authoritarian control. The transition planning process became another opportunity for innovation and citizen engagement. Rather than simply organizing elections between competing political parties, Traoré's administration established citizens' assemblies that would help design new constitutional arrangements and electoral systems. The process emphasized broad participation and consensus building rather than winner-take-all competition that had characterized previous democratic transitions. International development experts began studying the Burkina Faso model as a potential template for other post-colonial societies seeking to balance economic development with political stability. The combination of assertive resource nationalism, strategic international partnerships, and inclusive domestic governance offered lessons that extended far beyond West Africa. Most importantly for ordinary Burkinabe citizens, the transformation had restored their sense of dignity and possibility. Children who had grown up watching foreign companies extract their country's wealth while their families struggled with poverty now attended modern schools and dreamed of careers in engineering, medicine, and business. Parents who had assumed their country would remain perpetually dependent on foreign aid and investment began planning businesses and community development projects that reflected genuine confidence in the future. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's Defiant stand for justice had not only changed Burkina Faso, but had also demonstrated that the cycle of exploitation and dependency that had characterized post-colonial Africa could be broken through courage, careful planning, and unwavering commitment to the principle that natural resources should benefit the people who live above them rather than corporations and governments thousands of miles away.